My name is William Reeves, and I never thought I'd return to these woods. Not after what happened to Sarah, my wife, in that logging accident 2 years ago. But here I am, steering our newly bought RV down the winding roads of Hocking Hills, with my 16-year-old daughter Lucy sitting quietly beside me. Lucy hasn't spoken much since her mother died. The doctors call it selective mutism. Their fancy way of saying trauma can steal a child's voice. I bought this 1966 Dodge Travco with the settlement money from the logging company, hoping a father-daughter road trip might help her heal. Maybe help us both heal. The autumn leaves are turning golden, just like Sarah's hair used to be. Lucy has her mother's hair too, though she keeps it tied back now, her eyes fixed on the old-growth forest passing by our windows. I catch her touching the crystal necklace Sarah gave her on her 14th birthday, the last birthday they spent together. "Almost there, kiddo," I say, trying to sound cheerful. Lucy just nods, but I notice her shoulders tense as we pass the "Welcome to Old Man's Cave Campground" sign. Something about these woods feels different now. The trees seem taller, darker somehow, their branches reaching over the road like gnarled fingers. I park our RV in the designated spot, and the engine's rumble dies into an uneasy silence. The October wind whispers through the trees, carrying the musty scent of fallen leaves and something else, something older, earthier. Lucy presses her hand against the window, and for a moment, I swear I see something move between the trees, but it's probably just shadows playing tricks on my tired eyes. "Home sweet home for the next few days?" I say, forcing a smile. Lucy turns to me, and in her eyes, I see a flicker of something. Fear? Or is it recognition? She pulls out her notepad, her way of talking since the accident, and writes 3 words that make my blood run cold. Mom was right. I want to ask her what she means, but the sun is setting fast, painting the forest in deep reds and purples. As I start setting up camp, I can't shake the feeling that something in these ancient woods is watching us, waiting. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't such a good idea after all. That first night in the woods was when things started feeling wrong. After setting up camp, I made Lucy's favorite dinner, mac and cheese with hot dogs cut into little stars, just like Sarah used to make. Lucy barely touched her food. Her eyes kept darting to the darkness beyond our RV's windows. I was washing up the dishes when I first heard it. Heavy footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves outside. Too heavy to be a deer, too rhythmic to be a bear. Lucy heard it too. I could tell by the way she grabbed her notepad so tight, her knuckles turned white. "Probably just another camper," I said, more to convince myself than her. But when I shined my flashlight out the window, there was nobody there. Just the trees, their shadows dancing in the beam of light. That's when I noticed something strange on our RV windows, weird symbols, like someone had drawn them with their finger in the evening dew. They looked old, like the kind you'd see in history books about Native Americans, but something was off about them. They seemed to shine faintly in the dark, like those glow-in-the-dark stars kids stick on their bedroom ceilings. Lucy tugged at my sleeve and showed me her notepad. "We need to talk to the ranger." The next morning, we walked to the ranger station. Ranger Tom was a tall man with gray hair and worried eyes. When I showed him a photo I'd taken of the symbols, his face went pale. "Where exactly are you folks camped?" he asked, his voice shaking a little. I told him our spot number, and he started shuffling through some papers on his desk. "There's been some strange things happening lately," he said slowly. "Cattle gone missing from nearby farms. Weird marks on trees. Some campers said they heard things in the night." Lucy was writing frantically in her notepad. She showed it to the ranger, the Whispering Walker. Ranger Tom dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the floor, but he didn't seem to notice. "Where did you hear that name?" he whispered. But Lucy just stared at him, her face as white as paper. That's when I realized our little camping trip was about to become something much scarier. And somehow, my quiet daughter knew more about it than she was telling me. On our walk back to the RV, I noticed something else. The trees seemed closer together than they were yesterday, like they had moved during the night. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. Sarah had warned me about these woods before she died. I should have listened. That afternoon, Lucy disappeared into the caves. My heart nearly stopped when I couldn't find her at first. I ran through the campground calling her name, my voice echoing off the rocky walls. After 15 terrifying minutes, I found her in one of the smaller caves, her flashlight beam dancing on the walls. She was staring at something on the cave wall, more symbols, but these looked ancient, carved deep into the rock. Next to them were little wooden figures hanging from strings, old and weathered. They looked like the kind of warning signs you'd put up to keep people away. Lucy was copying them into her notebook, her hand shaking. "We need to go home," I said, grabbing her arm gently. But she pulled away and wrote quickly, "Mom found these too." My stomach dropped. Sarah had never told me about finding anything in these caves. What else hadn't she told me? That's when we heard it, a sound that made both of us freeze. It was like branches breaking, but much louder, coming from deeper in the cave. Then came a smell, like wet leaves and something rotten. Lucy's flashlight beam caught something moving in the darkness, something tall, much too tall to be human. We ran. Back at the RV, I locked all the doors and closed all the curtains. Lucy was frantically flipping through old newspaper clippings she'd gotten from somewhere. She showed me one from 1928. Mining disaster claims lives. 12 miners missing after cave collapse. But it was the next article that made my hands shake. From 1968, just a few months before Sarah's accident. Strange sightings continue in Hocking Hills. Locals claim forest guardian awakened. Night was falling fast, and the woods seemed to press closer around our RV. The trees creaked and swayed even though there wasn't any wind. Lucy wrote something and held it up. "It comes at night. It's looking for me." "What's looking for you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. That's when all our lights went out. In the sudden darkness, I heard those heavy footsteps again, circling our RV. Through a gap in the curtains, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice, 2 glowing green eyes, 9 feet off the ground, and the shadow of what looked like antlers. But they were giving off a strange, pale light. Lucy grabbed my hand and wrote one last thing in the dark. The same thing that took Mom. I'll never forget what happened next. The thing outside moved closer to our RV, and I finally saw it in the moonlight. It looked like a person, but wrong, so wrong. It was tall as a tree, with skin like bark and antlers that glowed with a sickly green light. But its eyes, they were human eyes, filled with something ancient and angry. Lucy wasn't scared anymore. She just stared at it, like she was in a trance. The creature raised one long arm, and suddenly, all the plants around our RV started growing crazy fast. Vines shot up from the ground, wrapping around our tires. Tree branches bent down, scraping against our roof. "Lucy, get away from the window," I yelled, but when I tried to pull her back, something strange happened. The old scar on my leg from the logging accident burst open, fresh blood soaking through my jeans. The pain brought me to my knees. Through the window, I saw other campers running, screaming. Their tents were being swallowed by plants that grew like they were in a speeded-up movie. But the creature didn't care about them. It just kept staring at Lucy. Then Lucy did something that scared me more than anything else. She started writing, but her hand was moving by itself, scratching out words I couldn't read. When she showed me the paper, the letters seemed to shift and move. "The forest remembers what you did, Dad." Suddenly, the air filled with tiny glowing spores, like fireflies but not quite right. They swirled around us, and everything started looking weird. The walls of our RV seemed to breathe. I could hear whispers coming from the trees outside, and they sounded like Sarah's voice. "This isn't real," I kept saying to myself. "This can't be real." But Lucy wrote again, "It's all real, Dad. Mom tried to stop them from cutting down the sacred trees. That's why the forest chose her. And when she refused to become its guardian, I couldn't breathe." The logging accident that killed Sarah, had it really been an accident? The creature outside pressed its hand against our RV window, leaving a glowing handprint. Where it touched, the metal began to rust and decay, like time was speeding up. Lucy stood up, her eyes now glowing with the same green light as the creature's antlers. She wrote one last thing before walking toward the door. "The forest needs a guardian, Dad. It's been waiting for me." I tried to stop her, but my whole body felt heavy, like I was moving through mud. The spores were everywhere now, and in their light I started seeing things. Memories of the day Sarah died, but different from how I remembered them. The truth was finally coming out, and it was more horrible than I could have imagined. In the swirling green spores, I saw the truth about Sarah's last day. She hadn't died in a logging accident. She discovered something in these woods, something the logging company wanted to keep secret. Through the haze, I watched the memory play out like an old movie. Sarah had found ancient trees marked with those same glowing symbols. She tried to stop the logging, saying the forest was sacred ground, but nobody listened. That's when the Whispering Walker first appeared to her, offering to make her its guardian. But Sarah refused. She had a family, a daughter to raise. The creature didn't take rejection well. Now Lucy was walking toward the RV door, her movements stiff like a sleepwalker. "Lucy, please," I begged, fighting through the pain in my leg. "Don't open that door." She turned to me, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time in 2 years, she spoke. Her voice was rough from not being used, but the words were clear. "Dad, Mom's still here. She's trapped in the forest." The door swung open by itself. Outside, the creature stood waiting, surrounded by a circle of smaller beings that looked like shadows with glowing eyes. The trees had moved even closer, making a wall around our RV. Other campers were trapped in vine cocoons, unconscious but alive. "Take me instead," I shouted at the creature. "Leave my daughter alone." The thing tilted its head, antlers casting weird shadows on the ground. Then it spoke, its voice sounding like rustling leaves and cracking branches. "The forest chooses. The forest remembers. The forest needs young blood." Lucy stepped outside. The moment her feet touched the ground, plants started growing around her shoes, holding her in place. Her hair began glowing with the same green light as the creature's antlers. "Mom refused to be the guardian," Lucy said, her voice getting stronger. "The forest killed her for saying no. But I'm saying yes, Dad. I'm saying yes to save everyone else." The creature reached out its long fingers toward Lucy. But before it could touch her, the ground started shaking. A bright light burst through the trees, headlights, lots of them. Ranger Tom's voice boomed through a megaphone. "This is your last warning. The forest is being evacuated. Fire's coming." Through the trees, I could see an orange glow. The forest was burning. Everything happened so fast after that. The forest fire was racing toward us, turning the night sky orange. The creature let out a horrible scream that shook the trees. All around us, the trapped campers were waking up, fighting against their vine prisons. "Lucy!" I shouted, limping toward her through the pain. The plants holding her feet were growing thicker, climbing up her legs. Her skin was starting to look like tree bark. That's when I saw her, Sarah. Not just her voice this time, but her ghost, glowing blue against the orange fire. She was trapped in one of the oldest trees, her face pressed against the bark like she was behind glass. "William?" Sarah's voice echoed in my head. "The forest needs a sacrifice to sleep again. That's why it took me. That's why it wants Lucy." The Whispering Walker roared as the fire got closer. Its smaller shadow creatures scattered into the darkness. The heat was getting intense, and smoke filled the air. Lucy reached out toward her mother's tree, crying. I knew what I had to do. "Hey, you!" I yelled at the creature. "You want someone to punish for hurting your forest? I'm the one who led the logging crew here. I'm the one who cut down your sacred trees. Take me." The creature turned its glowing eyes on me. The ground rumbled, and more vines shot up, wrapping around my legs. But this time, I didn't fight them. "Dad, no!" Lucy screamed, her voice breaking. The plants around her feet began to loosen. "Lucy, run to Ranger Tom," I said, trying to sound brave as the vines pulled me toward the creature. "Your mom and I will always love you." The forest guardian reached for me with its long fingers. Behind it, Sarah's ghost pressed harder against the tree bark, cracking it. As the creature touched my chest, I felt ice cold spreading through my body. But I smiled, because I saw Lucy running to safety, the plants releasing her completely. The fire reached us just then. The creature shrieked as flames touched its ancient body. The tree holding Sarah burst open, and her spirit flew out like a blue comet. She wrapped around Lucy, protecting her from the flames, guiding her to the rangers. The last thing I saw was Sarah's spirit turning back to me, reaching out. Then the burning forest swallowed everything in light and heat. I became part of the forest that night, just like Sarah had. But we made sure our sacrifice meant something. Lucy was safe, and the ancient guardian would sleep again, deep under the burned ground. Sometimes, people camping in the new forest that grew say they see two blue lights moving between the trees at night, watching over their daughter. And if you listen carefully, you might hear whispers in the wind, telling our story. But Lucy never returned to those woods. She didn't need to. She carries the forest's magic inside her now, along with the love of two parents who gave everything to keep her safe. My name is Marcus Blackwood, and I never thought I'd be telling this story. Even now, my hands shake as I write these words. What happened in the boundary waters of Minnesota back in '77 changed me and my boy David forever. I was 45 then, still carrying the weight of Vietnam in my head and trying to be a father to a 15-year-old who just lost his mother. Sarah, my wife, had been gone 6 months, and the silence in our house was eating us alive. David barely spoke anymore, spending most of his time locked in his room with those rock music records of his. I knew I had to do something before I lost him too. That's when I saw the old Winnebago for sale in our neighbor's driveway. A '75 Brave, worn but still running. Something about that faded brown stripe along its side reminded me of camping trips my dad took me on as a kid. Maybe that's what David and I needed, just some time away from everything, a chance to talk without all the memories of Sarah hanging in the air between us. I bought the RV that afternoon, handed over $1,200 of my savings. David rolled his eyes when I told him about our upcoming trip, but I caught that tiny spark of interest he tried to hide. "Dad, it's almost winter," he said, trying to sound annoyed. But I knew better. That was the most he'd said to me in weeks. I picked late October for our trip, thinking the crowds would be gone and we'd have the wilderness to ourselves. The weather report mentioned possible snow, but I figured my military training had prepared me for worse. Looking back now, I realize how wrong I was. No amount of training could have prepared us for what was waiting in those woods. The morning we left, frost covered the ground like a warning. David sat in the passenger seat of the Winnebago, his black hair falling over his eyes just like his mother's used to. He had her cassette player on his lap, the one she used to listen to during her hospital stays. Neither of us knew then that this wouldn't be just another camping trip. We didn't know that some things in this world are older than time, hungrier than death, and more patient than any predator should be. This is our story. A story about a father and son, about loss and survival, and about something that lives in the ancient forests of the North, something that should have stayed in the nightmares of those who first walked these lands. I'm writing this down now because people need to know. They need to understand why sometimes the woods go quiet, why the cold feels alive, and why you should never, ever ignore the warnings of those who know the old stories. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, when we first turned onto that lonely road leading into the boundary waters, not knowing we were driving straight into a nightmare that would change us forever. The first strange thing I noticed was how quickly it got dark that evening. We'd been driving for about 6 hours when we finally found a good spot to park the RV, right near the edge of a small lake. The sun wasn't supposed to set for another hour, but the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. "This looks good," I said, trying to sound cheerful as I turned off the engine. David just shrugged, but at least he helped me set up camp. The air felt different here, colder than it should be. My old military instincts were starting to buzz, like they used to in the jungle when something wasn't quite right. We got the RV leveled and I started making hot dogs for dinner when I heard it, a sound that made my spine tingle. It was like a mix between a wolf's howl and the wind, but somehow wrong. David heard it too. I saw him freeze with his hot dog halfway to his mouth. "What was that?" he asked, finally showing some real interest in something. "Probably just the wind," I said, but I didn't believe it myself. In Vietnam, I'd learned to trust my gut, and right now it was telling me something wasn't right. After dinner, while David was reading his comic books, I stepped outside to check our supplies. The temperature had dropped so much that I could see my breath. That's when I noticed the tracks in the mud near our campsite. At first, I thought they might be from a moose. We'd seen a few on the drive up. But these were different. They were huge, deeper than they should be, and something about them looked almost human-like. I was still staring at those tracks when an old Native American man appeared so quietly, I nearly jumped out of my skin. He introduced himself as Thomas Running Bear, said he lived nearby. "You shouldn't be here," he said simply, looking at our RV. "Not now. Not when the first snow is coming." I started to explain about our camping trip, but he cut me off. "There are things in these woods," he said, his voice low and serious. "Things that wake up when the cold comes. Things that hunger." He looked toward our RV, where David was visible through the window, especially for the young ones. I wanted to laugh it off, tell him we'd be fine, but those tracks in the mud kept catching my eye, and that strange howl still echoed in my mind. Before I could say anything else, Thomas turned and walked into the darkening woods, seeming to disappear between one blink and the next. Back in the RV, I found David had fallen asleep with his comic book on his chest. As I covered him with a blanket, I noticed how cold it had gotten inside, despite the heater running full blast. That night, I cleaned my old service pistol, telling myself it was just habit, but deep down, I knew something else was going on. I didn't sleep much that first night. The wind kept making sounds that almost seemed like words, and twice I thought I heard footsteps circling our RV, heavy footsteps that made the gravel crunch. But when I looked out the windows, I couldn't see anything in the darkness. Nothing except the trees, their branches swaying in ways that didn't match the wind, and what looked like pairs of eyes reflecting the moonlight, watching us from the forest's edge. The next morning, I woke up to find frost on the inside of our RV windows, which made no sense since the heater had been running all night. David was already awake, sitting at the small table, eating his third bowl of cereal. "I'm still hungry, Dad," he said, his voice sounding different, almost desperate. "Can we make more breakfast?" While I was cooking extra eggs, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. About 50 yards from our RV lay a deer carcass that hadn't been there the night before. But it wasn't the normal work of wolves or bears. The deer looked like it had been arranged, placed there deliberately. Its bones were twisted in ways that weren't natural. "Stay in the RV," I told David, grabbing my flashlight even though it was daylight. As I got closer to the deer, I saw something that brought back memories of Vietnam, the way the enemy used to leave warnings. Around the deer, drawn in the frost, were strange symbols I'd never seen before. That's when our radio suddenly crackled to life back in the RV. We hadn't even turned it on. Through the static, I heard a voice. "Help point 1952. They're hungry. Don't let them in." The voice sounded old, like a recording from many years ago. David was staring at the radio, his face pale. "Dad," he whispered, "I don't feel so good." I looked at my son and noticed something that made my heart skip. His eyes seemed different, lighter, almost yellow in the morning light. And his fingers, were they longer than usual, or was my mind playing tricks on me? The temperature kept dropping, even though the sun was up. Our food in the refrigerator was frozen solid, despite the RV being warm enough. David kept saying he was hungry, no matter how much he ate. And then I saw it through my old military binoculars, something standing between the trees that shouldn't exist. It was tall, impossibly tall. At first, I thought it was just a dead tree, but then it moved. Its body was skinny as a skeleton, with skin like old bark, and on its head. I dropped the binoculars when I saw what looked like antlers, but wrong, twisted, reaching toward the sky like broken branches. When I looked again, it was gone, but I could feel it watching us. Worse, I could feel it calling to us. David felt it too. I could tell by the way he kept staring into the woods, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. That afternoon, Thomas Running Bear returned. He took one look at David, and his face turned grave. "It's starting," he said quietly. "The wendigo has already begun its work. Your boy, it's chosen him." "What's happening to me?" David asked, his voice shaking. He was shivering despite wearing 3 sweaters, and I noticed with horror that his teeth looked sharper when he spoke. Thomas pulled an old leather journal from his coat. "There are stories," he said, "old stories about what walks these woods when winter comes. Stories about a hunger that never ends. And once it chooses someone." He didn't finish his sentence. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. My boy was in danger, and I had no idea how to save him. That night, everything went wrong. The temperature dropped so low that ice started forming on the RV's steering wheel. David's shivering got worse, but he kept saying he wasn't cold, just hungry. Always hungry. I was making soup when I heard it, Sarah's voice, coming from outside. "Marcus, David, please let me in. It's so cold out here." My heart stopped. It sounded exactly like her, like my wife was right outside our door. David jumped up, his eyes wide. "Mom?" he whispered. "Don't!" I grabbed his arm before he could reach the door. "David, think! Your mother, she's gone. That's not her." But the voice kept calling, becoming more desperate. "David, honey, please, why won't you help me?" I held David back, but I could feel him trembling. Then the voice changed, becoming angry, inhuman. The whole RV shook as something huge slammed against its side. "It's trying to trick us," I said, holding David close. But when I looked at him, his eyes had that yellow glow again, and his fingers. They were definitely longer now, the nails turning dark. "I need to go out there," David said in a voice that didn't sound like his anymore. "I'm so hungry, Dad. So hungry it hurts." That's when the radio came alive again, playing fragments of old distress calls. Different voices, different years, all saying the same things about hunger and cold, and something hunting them in the dark. Through the RV's window, I saw it clearly this time. The creature stood at least 15 feet tall, its body like a walking skeleton wrapped in gray stretched skin. Its antlers scraped against the trees as it moved, and its eyes were full of starving winter. David started walking toward the door like he was in a trance. I had to do something. I grabbed Thomas's journal and started reading frantically. There had to be a way to save my son. The journal told stories of the wendigo, an ancient spirit that created endless hunger in its victims, slowly turning them into creatures like itself. The more they ate, the hungrier they got, until they started craving things no person should ever want. But there was hope, a small note at the bottom of one page. The transformation could be stopped, but only through sacrifice. A parent's willing sacrifice could break the wendigo's hold on their child. Outside, the creature started circling our RV, its long fingers scraping against the metal. Each scratch sounded like screaming. David's skin was starting to stretch tight across his face, and when he opened his mouth to speak, I saw too many teeth. "Dad," he managed to say, fighting whatever was trying to take him over. "Help me, please help me." I looked at my boy, remembering the day he was born, the way Sarah had smiled when she first held him. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed my old service pistol and the flare gun from our emergency kit. "I'm going to save you, son," I said, moving toward the door. "Whatever happens next, remember that I love you." The wendigo was waiting outside, its shadow falling over our RV like a prison. I stepped outside into the bitter cold, my breath freezing in the air. The wendigo towered over me, its antlers blocking out the stars. The smell hit me first, like rotting meat and ancient ice. "Take me," I said firmly, raising my gun. "Leave my boy alone." The creature tilted its head, almost like it was curious. Then it spoke, using Sarah's voice again, but mixed with something else. Something that sounded like cracking ice and breaking bones. "The boy is already mine," it said, just like all the others before him. Inside the RV, David screamed, not in fear, but in hunger. I could hear him fighting against it, trying to hold on to who he was. The windows frosted over completely, and the metal walls groaned in the cold. That's when Thomas Running Bear appeared from the darkness, holding something in his hands, an old bone knife carved with symbols. "The ritual," he said quickly. "It must be done now, before your son is lost forever." The wendigo moved faster than anything that big should be able to move. Its long arms reached for me, but my military training kicked in. I rolled, fired my gun. The bullets did nothing except make it angry. Thomas started chanting in his native language, his voice rising above the wind. The bone knife began to glow with a faint blue light. The wendigo screamed, a sound that made the trees shake and ice crack. "David," I shouted, "fight it, son. Remember who you are." Inside the RV, David was changing. His fingers had grown into claws, his teeth sharp as knives. But in his eyes, I could still see my boy fighting to stay human. The wendigo swung at me again, and this time its claws caught my shoulder. The cold was worse than the pain, a cold that went straight to my soul. But I knew what I had to do. I lit the flare, its red light casting strange shadows. Thomas was still chanting, the bone knife glowing brighter. The wendigo backed away from the light, giving me my chance. A father's willing sacrifice, I remembered from the journal. I understood now. It wasn't about dying. It was about being willing to take your child's place. I stepped toward the creature, holding the flare high. "You want hunger?" I shouted. "Take mine. Take my memories, my pain, everything I carried back from Vietnam. Take it all, but leave my son." The wendigo reached for me with both hands. Behind me, I heard David cry out, "Dad, no!" Thomas thrust the glowing knife into my free hand. I knew what to do, like the knowledge was carved into my bones. As the wendigo's fingers touched me, I plunged the knife into my own heart. The world exploded into blue light. The last thing I heard was David screaming, but this time it was his voice, his real voice, my boy's voice. I woke up 3 days later in a small clinic near the Boundary Waters. David was sitting next to my bed, looking normal again, no long fingers, no sharp teeth, just my boy with tears in his eyes. "Dad," he whispered when he saw me open my eyes, "you're alive." Thomas Running Bear was there too, standing in the corner. He explained what happened after I stabbed myself with the bone knife. The wendigo had screamed, not in triumph, but in defeat. The creature had tried to take my sacrifice, my pain, my memories, but the knife had changed something. Instead of feeding the wendigo, it had wounded it. "The spirit feeds on pain and hunger," Thomas said quietly. "But willing sacrifice? That's something it can't digest. You poisoned it with love, Marcus." The doctors couldn't explain how I survived a stab to the heart. They found no wound, just a scar shaped like one of those strange symbols from Thomas's journal. David told me the wendigo had vanished in a burst of blue light, and the unnatural cold had disappeared with it. But some things didn't go back to normal. David and I could feel it, a change in both of us. The hunger never completely left him, though it was manageable now. And me? Sometimes when it's very quiet, I can hear the wind speaking in voices of those the wendigo took over the years. Thomas gave me his journal before we left, saying we might need it someday. "The wendigo isn't dead," he warned. "Such things can't be killed, only wounded." It will sleep now, maybe for years, maybe for decades, but it will wake again. That was 40 years ago. David's grown now, with a family of his own. But every October, when the first snow threatens, we both feel a pulling in our bones. Sometimes, David's son, my grandson, complains about being hungry, no matter how much he eats, and when I look in his eyes, I sometimes catch a flash of yellow. I'm writing this story now because David called me yesterday. He's planning a camping trip with his son, just like I did with him. The weather report mentions early snow. I've mailed him Thomas's journal, just in case. Because some things are passed down in families, like eye color, or the shape of your smile. And sometimes, in the dark woods of the north, when the first snow falls, ancient hungers wake up and remember. If you're ever camping in the Boundary Waters, and you feel an unnatural cold, or hear a voice calling that sounds like someone you've lost, remember my story. Remember that love can fight even the oldest, darkest hunger. And whatever you do, don't answer when something calls your name in the voice of someone who's gone. My name is Helen Mitchell, and I need to tell you about what happened to my family last September in the Pine Barrens. Even now, months later, my hands shake as I write this down. Some nights, I still wake up hearing those howls, seeing those red eyes in the dark. I'm a nurse at Memorial Hospital in Philadelphia, or at least I was, before everything changed. My husband Jack worked construction, and we had twin boys, Peter and Paul, who had just turned 13. We were a normal family, dealing with normal problems. Jack's business was struggling, and I was still trying to get over losing our baby girl 6 months earlier. The twins were acting out at school, and Jack and I were fighting more than ever. That's why we decided to take the RV trip. It was supposed to fix everything. The RV was our pride and joy, a 1981 Airstream Excella that Jack had fixed up himself. We'd taken it on weekend trips before, but this was going to be different. A whole week away, just the four of us and our German Shepherd Rex, a chance to become a real family again. I remember packing the RV that morning, trying to stay positive even though Jack and I had argued about the route the night before. The twins were actually excited for once. They hadn't been this happy since before we lost the baby. Peter was showing Paul some new card tricks he'd learned, and Rex was running around the yard, barking at squirrels. "It'll be just like old times," Jack had said, giving me that smile I'd fallen in love with years ago. Remember our first camping trip, when the boys were little? I wanted to believe him, I really did, but there was this feeling in my gut, something I couldn't shake. Maybe it was the nurse in me, always looking for symptoms, always waiting for something to go wrong, or maybe it was something else. A warning I should have listened to. We left Philadelphia around noon, heading east into New Jersey. The plan was simple. Spend a week in the Pine Barrens, hiking and camping and being together. The boys had their video games and comic books, Jack had his fishing gear, and I had brought my journal and some medical books I'd been meaning to catch up on. None of us had any idea that by the end of that week, our family would never be the same again. That some of us wouldn't come back at all. The first sign that something was wrong came when we got lost. The Pine Barrens looked different in the late afternoon light, all those twisted pine trees casting strange shadows. Our GPS stopped working about 2 hours in, and the paper map Jack brought wasn't much help. All the small roads looked the same, winding through the dense forest like snakes. "Dad, we've passed that weird-looking tree 3 times now," Paul said from the back of the RV. He was right. We were going in circles. The sun was setting, and the woods were getting darker. Rex, usually such a calm dog, started pacing back and forth in the RV, whining softly. I'd never seen him act like that before. "We should find a place to park for the night," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. "We can figure out where we are in the morning." Jack finally agreed, though I could see how tense his shoulders were as he gripped the steering wheel. He pulled the RV into a small clearing just off the road. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches scraping against the roof in the growing wind. While Jack set up the generator, I made sandwiches for dinner. The twins were unusually quiet, sitting at the small table and looking out the windows at the darkening forest. Even their usual bickering had stopped. That's when we heard it, a sound I'll never forget. At first, I thought it was just branches scratching the roof, but it was too regular, too deliberate. Scratch, scratch, pause. Scratch, scratch, pause. Like something was walking up there. Rex started growling, his ears flat against his head. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "Jack?" I whispered. "Do you hear that?" He nodded slowly, reaching for the flashlight. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it had started, but somehow that was worse. The silence felt heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. "It's probably just a raccoon," Jack said, but his voice didn't sound convinced. "I'll go check it out." "No," I grabbed his arm. "Stay inside, please." That's when Peter spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. "Mom, look at Rex." Our dog was staring at something through the window, his whole body rigid. I followed his gaze, and my blood ran cold. There, just at the edge of the clearing, two red eyes glowed in the darkness. They were too high up to be a normal animal. Whatever it was had to be standing at least 7 feet tall. The eyes blinked once, then vanished. But I knew, deep in my gut, that this was just the beginning. Something was out there in the dark, watching us, and it wasn't going away. None of us slept well that night. We kept the RV's lights on, huddled together in the main area. Rex wouldn't stop pacing and growling at the windows. Around midnight, the twins finally fell asleep, but Jack and I stayed awake, jumping at every little sound from outside. Morning came with a thick fog that made everything look ghostly. We needed supplies and directions, so Jack decided we should try to find a town. After driving for about an hour, we spotted a small diner called Randy's on the side of the road. It was one of those old places that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1960s. The bell above the door jingled as we walked in. Only 3 other people were there: an old man reading a newspaper, a trucker eating pancakes, and a waitress who looked about my age. Her name tag said Linda. "You folks aren't from around here, are you?" Linda asked while pouring us coffee. Her eyes kept darting to the twins, then back to me. Something about the way she looked at them made me uneasy. "No, we're just camping," I said. "Actually, we got a bit lost." Linda's hand shook slightly as she set down the coffee pot. "You shouldn't be camping out there right now, not this time of year." "Why not?" Peter asked. Before she could answer, we heard Rex barking frantically outside. Jack rushed to the window. Our dog was pulling hard on his leash, which we'd tied to the RV's door handle. He was facing the woods, hackles raised. "You should leave," Linda said quietly. "Today. Take the main road south, and don't stop until you're out of the barrens." "What's going on?" Jack demanded. "What aren't you telling us?" Linda glanced at the old man with the newspaper, who was now watching us. He gave her a small nod. "Things happen in these woods," she said, lowering her voice. "Especially during breeding season. People go missing. Last month, a whole family disappeared. Just vanished from their campsite. All they found was their car, with these strange scratches all over it." Paul grabbed my hand under the table. His palm was sweaty. "And there's something else," Linda continued. She reached under the counter and pulled out an old photo. It showed what looked like a huge footprint in the mud, 3-toed, with this weird shiny substance around it. That was taken 2 weeks ago, about 3 miles from here. The guy who took it, well, he's not around anymore. Just then, Rex's barking turned into a high-pitched whine. Then silence. Complete silence. We all ran outside. The fog had gotten thicker, but I could still see the RV clearly. The leash was still there, hanging from the door handle. But Rex was gone. We searched for Rex for hours. Jack and I called his name until our voices were hoarse, while the twins stayed in the RV as we'd insisted. The fog made everything worse. Sounds seemed to come from all directions. and shapes in the mist kept tricking our eyes. All we found was Rex's collar, lying in the dirt about 50 feet into the woods. The leather was torn, not cut, and there were these strange marks on it, like something had burned it. When I picked it up, it was still warm. "We need to call the police," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Jack pulled out his phone. No signal. Again. He kicked at the ground in frustration. "Let's head back to that diner, use their phone." But when we drove back, the diner was closed. Not just closed. It looked like it had been closed for years. The windows were dusty, and there were weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot. It was impossible. We'd been there just hours ago. "Mom," Peter called from the back of the RV. "Paul's not feeling good." I turned to find Paul holding his head, his face pale. "It's like a buzzing," he mumbled, "in my head, and I keep hearing whispers." Peter reached for his twin's hand. The moment their fingers touched, both boys gasped. Their eyes went wide, and blood started trickling from Paul's nose. "They're calling us?" Peter whispered, and a drop of blood appeared under his nose, too. "They want us to come out and play." Jack started the RV, his hands shaking. "We're getting out of here now." That's when we heard it. A low, deep howl that seemed to make the whole RV vibrate. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It sounded almost human, but wrong. So wrong. The twins clutched their heads and screamed in unison. The RV's lights flickered, and the engine made a horrible grinding noise before dying completely. Through the windshield, I saw them. 3 pairs of red eyes in the fog moving closer. They were walking on 2 legs, but their shapes were all wrong, too tall, too thin. One of them tilted its head, and I felt this pressure in my mind, like something was trying to get in. "Helen," Jack whispered, "look at the RV's side." I turned and felt my heart stop. There, carved into the metal as if by burning claws, was a symbol I'd seen before in the old medical books I studied in nursing school. It was an ancient symbol for transformation, and it was still smoking. The next few hours were the longest of my life. We stayed inside the RV, Jack trying desperately to fix the engine while I tended to the twins. Their nosebleeds had stopped, but they kept staring out the windows, whispering to each other in voices too quiet for me to hear. "Mom," Paul said suddenly, his voice different somehow, "they're not trying to hurt us. They're trying to show us something." "Who is?" I asked, pressing a cold cloth to his forehead. "The others," Peter answered instead. "The ones who were changed. Like that boy from last summer." My hands froze. "What boy?" "The one in the picture at the diner," Paul said. "The one they didn't find. He's still here. He's one of them now." Jack came back inside, wiping grease from his hands. "The engine, it's like it melted from the inside. I've never seen anything like it." That's when we heard the helicopter. The sound cut through the fog, and bright searchlights swept across the trees. Military voices shouted in the distance, and we could see figures moving through the woods with flashlights. "Help!" Jack yelled, running to the door. "We're over here." "Dad, no!" Both twins screamed together, but it was too late. The searchlight found us, and for a moment, I felt relieved. Then I saw what was written on the helicopter's side: U.S. Military Research Division, Project Nightwatch. A man in a hazmat suit approached our RV, holding some kind of device that was beeping rapidly. Behind him, soldiers with strange-looking guns spread out through the trees. 4 civilians, he spoke into a radio. 2 adults, 2 adolescents, showing signs of exposure. Readings are off the charts. "Please," I called out. "Our dog is missing, and our boys are sick." The man looked up at me, his face hidden behind his mask. "Ma'am, your boys aren't sick. They're changing, and we're here to make sure that doesn't happen." A howl cut through the air, closer this time. The soldiers raised their weapons. In the woods, those red eyes appeared again, dozens of them now, surrounding us in a circle. The twins stood up together, their eyes reflecting the searchlights in a way that wasn't quite natural anymore. "They're here to protect us," Peter said. "From them," Paul finished, pointing at the soldiers. The man in the hazmat suit reached for something in his pocket. "I'm sorry," he said, "but we can't let this spread." That's when all hell broke loose. The night exploded into chaos. The creatures, I still don't know what to call them, burst from the woods. They moved so fast, like shadows with those glowing red eyes. The soldiers started shooting, but their weapons didn't fire bullets. Instead, they shot beams of blue light that made the air smell like a thunderstorm. "Get down!" Jack screamed, pulling me to the RV floor. Through the windows, I could see the creatures fighting the soldiers. They were even more terrifying up close, tall, wolf-like things walking on two legs, but their faces looked almost human. Then I heard a familiar bark. There, in the middle of the fight, was Rex. But he wasn't our Rex anymore. His fur had turned dark gray, and his eyes glowed that same terrible red. He looked at me through the window, and for a moment, I saw recognition in those eyes. "Mom, Dad, we have to go with them," Peter said, his voice changing, becoming deeper. When I turned to look at my boys, I almost screamed. Their eyes had started to glow too, just a faint red shimmer. "They're not monsters," Paul added. "They're like us. People who changed. People who were made this way." The hazmat suit man banged on our door. "Let us help you. Your sons, we can stop the change if we act fast." But then, one of the creatures jumped onto our RV's roof. It was bigger than the others, and when it howled, all the twins' nosebleeds started again. But this time, they smiled through the blood. The creature spoke, not with its mouth, but somehow inside all our heads. Its voice was like gravel and static. "The children belong with us now," it said. "They were chosen, like all the others, like your dog. The military made us, and now they hunt us. But we survive. We grow stronger." Jack grabbed both boys, trying to hold them back, but they were already changing. Their fingers were getting longer, their teeth sharper. "Please," I begged the creature. "They're just children." "They are becoming more than children," it answered. "The question is, will you let them go, or watch them be destroyed?" The hazmat suit man was cutting through our door with some kind of laser. The twins were shaking now, their skin rippling like water. I had to make a choice, right there, right then, a choice no mother should ever have to make. And I knew whatever I decided, our family would never be the same again. I did what any mother would do. I chose to save my children, even if it meant losing them. "Jack," I whispered, grabbing his arm, "we have to let them go." "No," he shouted, still holding the twins. But they were burning hot now, like they had terrible fevers. Their faces were changing, becoming longer, sharper. The hazmat suit man finally cut through the door. "Stand back. This is your last warning." That's when Peter and Paul broke free from their father's grip. They moved so fast, 1 minute they were there, the next they were at the door. Their clothes were tearing as their bodies changed. "We love you," they said together, their voices a strange mix of human and something else. "But we have to go." The creature on the roof reached down with long, clawed hands. The twins grabbed them without hesitation. In seconds, they were gone, vanishing into the darkness with the pack. The soldiers rushed in, but they were too late. The hazmat suit man pulled off his mask, revealing a tired, sad face. "I'm Dr. Roberts," he said, "and there's something you need to know about what happened here in the Pine Barrens 30 years ago." He pulled out an old folder from his suit. Inside were pictures of a military lab, scientists working with strange creatures in cages, and dates, experiments going back to the 1950s. "We were trying to make super soldiers," he explained, "but something went wrong. The test subjects, they escaped. They started changing others, creating a pack. Your twins, they're special. Twins are more susceptible to the change." "Can we save them?" Jack asked, his voice breaking. Dr. Roberts looked down. "They're not lost. They're just different now. They'll come back sometimes, watching from the woods, but they belong to the pack." As if to prove his point, we heard howling in the distance, but this time, I recognized the voices in those howls. My boys were saying goodbye. That was 3 months ago. We still live near the Pine Barrens now. Sometimes on full moon nights, we see red eyes watching from the trees. Sometimes we find presents on our porch, small things the twins want us to have. Last week, it was Peter's old baseball card collection, somehow perfectly preserved. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I hear them howling in the distance. Not in pain or anger, but in joy. They're running free with their new family, with Rex by their side. I miss them every day, but at least I know they're alive, even if they're not the same. And sometimes, that has to be enough. But the hardest part? Knowing there are more military experiments out there. More families who might go through what we did. More children who might hear the call of the pack. So I'm writing this as a warning. If you're ever in the Pine Barrens, and you see red eyes in the dark, run. Or maybe, if you're like my boys, you'll hear the call too. And then you'll have to make your own choice. Because the pack is still out there, still growing, still watching. And they're always looking for new family members. I should mention what happened after that night, because the story didn't end there. The military tried to cover everything up, of course. They made us sign papers, threatened us with all sorts of legal trouble if we ever told anyone. But how do you keep quiet about losing your children to something like this? Jack and I moved to a small house right at the edge of the Pine Barrens. We couldn't bring ourselves to leave, knowing our boys were out there somewhere. Our marriage changed too. Not broken exactly, but different. We share a secret now that nobody else would understand. Last month, something strange happened. I was sitting on our back porch late at night, like I often do, when I heard rustling in the trees. There stood Paul, half human and half something else. But I knew those eyes. They were still my son's eyes, even with the red glow. "Mom," he said, his voice rough but still familiar. "Peter wanted to come too, but he's watching the younger ones." "Younger ones?" I asked. Paul nodded. "There are more like us now, lost kids who needed a family. We protect them, teach them, like the others taught us." He told me about their life in the woods, how they live in the old military bunkers, how they can change back to almost human during the day, how they've learned to control their powers. "They aren't monsters," he said. "They're just different." "Are you happy?" I asked, fighting back tears. He smiled, showing sharp teeth that somehow didn't scare me anymore. "Yes, Mom, we're free here. No more headaches, no more feeling different from everyone else. We belong." Before he left, he hugged me. His fur was soft, and he smelled like pine needles and wild air. "We'll always love you and Dad," he whispered. "We're still your sons. We're just part of two families now." Sometimes I see them running through the woods at night, two faster shapes among the pack, always together. The twins who found their true nature in these dark woods. My boys who became something else, something wild and free. Dr. Roberts still visits sometimes, bringing news of other incidents, other families. He's not trying to stop the pack anymore. Sometimes, he told me last week, our mistakes turn into something better than what we planned. I keep the porch light on every night now, just in case they want to visit, just in case other lost children find their way here, searching for their true family. Because I've learned something important. Family isn't always what we expect it to be. Sometimes it has sharp teeth and red eyes. Sometimes it howls at the moon. And sometimes, letting go is the greatest love of all. My name is Richard Cooper, and I should have listened to the warnings. Looking back now, all the signs were there, screaming at us to turn back. But I was too stubborn, too eager to make another groundbreaking discovery in the caves I'd spent my whole life exploring. I'm a professional spelunker. That's a fancy word for someone who explores caves for a living. At 38, I've crawled through more dark holes and underground passages than I can count. My younger brother Michael, a geologist, usually joins me on these expeditions. This time, his wife Beth came along too. She's a photographer who wanted to document our findings in the unmapped cave system near Mammoth Cave, Kentucky. That spring was unusually dry. and something felt off from the moment we parked our converted 1989 Fleetwood Bounder RV near the cave entrance. The local folks were acting strange. They'd look away when we asked about the caves, hurrying their children inside when we passed. One old-timer at the gas station just shook his head when I mentioned where we were heading. "Them caves ain't natural," he'd said, his weathered hands trembling as he handed me my change. "The white devils below, they're waiting." I laughed it off then. After all, every small town has its local legends, right? If only I'd known that sometimes legends have teeth. Sharp ones. The first day started normally enough. We set up our base camp, and Beth took some preliminary photos of the cave entrance. Michael got excited about some odd rock formations, rambling on about geological anomalies like he always does. But it was what we found near the entrance that should have sent us packing. Ancient drawings carved into the rock, showing tall, skinny figures with no eyes. The locals called them cave crawlers. Our equipment started picking up weird seismic activity that evening. Nothing major, just little tremors that made our instruments dance. Michael said it was probably just normal cave settling, but deep down, I knew better. 15 years of cave exploration teaches you to trust your gut, and mine was screaming that something was very wrong. That night, as we sat in our RV planning the next day's expedition, we heard it for the first time, a clicking sound echoing from deep within the cave. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not water dripping, not rocks settling, not any of the normal cave sounds I'd grown used to over the years. Beth grabbed her camera, excited to document whatever was making the noise. Michael checked his geological equipment again, muttering about unusual frequencies. But me? I just sat there, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I remember thinking, maybe those old-timers weren't so crazy after all. If only we'd left right then. If only we'd packed up and driven away. But we didn't. And what happened next? Well, that's when our real nightmare began. I'm telling this story now because people need to know the truth about what's down there, about what happened to us in those caves, about what we found, and what found us. But I should warn you, this isn't a story with a happy ending. Sometimes, the deepest horrors aren't in the darkness of the caves, but in the choices we make when faced with the unthinkable. And those clicks we heard that first night? They were just the beginning. The cave crawlers were calling to us, and soon, we'd learn exactly why the locals feared what lurked in the darkness below. The next morning, I woke up to find something strange on our RV. The metal side panels had these weird marks on them, like someone had spilled strong acid. Michael touched one of the spots and quickly pulled his hand back. It was still wet and burning. Beth took photos while I checked our equipment, trying not to show how worried I was. "We should check out the cave entrance," Michael said, already packing his gear. "Maybe there's some kind of natural chemical seeping from the rocks." I knew better. In all my years of caving, I'd never seen anything like this. But I kept quiet and nodded, watching Beth pack her camera equipment. She seemed excited, but I noticed her hands shaking a little as she changed her camera batteries. As we approached the cave entrance, we found something that made my stomach turn. There was a dead deer near the mouth of the cave, but it wasn't like any animal kill I'd ever seen. The deer's body looked melted in places. Its flesh had these strange white marks all over it, similar to the ones on our RV. "Richard, look at this," Beth called out, her voice trembling. She was pointing her camera at something on the cave wall, more of those ancient drawings we'd seen yesterday. But these were different. They showed people running from those tall, white figures. Some of the drawings showed the figures dragging people into dark spaces. We were setting up our lights when an old farmer came running toward us, out of breath and pale as a ghost. "You folks need to leave," he wheezed, leaning on his walking stick. "The white devils, they're waking up. It happens every few decades when the caves get dry enough." "What do you mean waking up?" Michael asked, but the old man just shook his head. "Last time was 53. My daddy saw them, tall as trees, white as bone, and hungry. So hungry." He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. They took 6 people that year. The government covered it all up, said it was cave-ins and accidents. But we knew. We all knew. I was about to ask more questions when we heard it again. That clicking sound from last night. But louder now. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The old farmer's eyes went wide with fear. "It's too late," he whispered, already backing away. "They're awake. God help you all." He turned and ran faster than I thought possible for someone his age. Beth moved closer to Michael, her camera forgotten at her side. "Maybe we should listen to him," she said quietly. "Something doesn't feel right here." I was about to agree when our equipment started going crazy. The seismic monitors were showing activity all around us, like something was moving through the cave system. Multiple somethings. Then we heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A high-pitched screech that echoed through the cave, followed by what sounded like claws scraping on rock. It was coming from deep inside the cave, and it was getting closer. Michael grabbed Beth's hand. "We need to get back to the RV, now." But as we turned to leave, I saw something move in the darkness of the cave entrance. Something tall, something white, something that shouldn't exist. And it saw us too. What happened next still haunts my nightmares. The thing in the cave entrance moved so fast, I barely had time to shout, "Run!" We sprinted back toward the RV, but I couldn't help looking over my shoulder. What I saw made me freeze for a second. It was like a person, but wrong in every way. Tall, maybe 7 feet, with skin so pale it seemed to glow in the dim light. But its face, there were no eyes, just smooth white skin where eyes should be. "Get inside!" I yelled, fumbling with the RV keys. Beth was already at the door, Michael right behind her. The creature moved like a spider, its long limbs carrying it across the ground faster than anything I'd ever seen. As we slammed the RV door shut, it let out another screech that made the windows vibrate. "What is that thing?" Beth's voice shook as she gripped her camera. Through the lens, she caught something none of us had noticed. There wasn't just one creature. In the shadows behind the first one, more white shapes were moving. The creatures surrounded our RV, their long fingers leaving those same burning marks on the windows. I could hear them clicking to each other, like they were talking. They seemed to be working together, testing our defenses. "The windows won't hold long," Michael said, pointing to where the glass was starting to bubble and crack from their touch. "We need a plan." I grabbed our emergency flares and my caving gear. "They don't have eyes," I said, thinking out loud. "They must use sound to find their way around, like bats. Maybe bright light and loud noise will confuse them." Just then, one of the creatures climbed onto the roof. We could hear its claws scraping against the metal. The ceiling began to drip with that same burning liquid they secreted. Beth screamed as a drop landed on her arm, leaving an angry red mark. "The old mining tunnels," Michael suddenly said, pulling out his map. "There's an old mining shaft about half a mile from here. If we can get there, it might connect to a different way out." "Are you crazy?" Beth whispered. "You want us to go underground with those things?" "We don't have a choice," I said, watching as more of the ceiling started to cave in. "They're going to get in here soon. At least in the mines, we might have a chance to hide or find another exit." I grabbed my backpack and handed out headlamps to everyone. When I set off the flare, we run. Don't look back, don't stop. Head straight for the mining entrance. My hand shook as I gripped the flare. "Ready?" Beth and Michael nodded, terror clear in their eyes. The creatures were all around us now, their clicking getting more excited, like they knew we were trapped. 3, 2, 1. I threw open the door and lit the flare. The bright red light filled the air, and the creatures screamed, a horrible sound that made my teeth hurt. We ran as fast as we could through the gap they left, our feet pounding against the ground. Behind us, I could hear them recovering, their clicks turning angry. They were coming after us, and they were fast. The old mining entrance was just ahead, a dark hole in the hillside. As we ran into the tunnel, I heard Beth cry out, I turned just in time to see her trip on an old railroad tie. Michael grabbed her arm, pulling her up, but not before one of the creatures got close enough to scratch her leg with its long claws. We ran deeper into the mine, the sound of clicking echoing all around us. But something was wrong with Beth's scratch. In the beam of our headlamps, I could see the skin around it starting to turn white. We huddled in a small side tunnel, trying to catch our breath. Beth was shaking, clutching her leg where the creature had scratched her. The white patch was spreading slowly, like frost on a window. "It burns," she whispered, tears running down her face. Michael held her close, his hands trembling as he tried to clean the wound with our first aid kit. But nothing we did seemed to help. The clicking sounds echoed through the tunnels, but they seemed farther away now. In the beam of our headlamps, I noticed something strange about the mine walls. They weren't normal. Mixed in with the old mining equipment were claw marks, and what looked like nests made of. I didn't want to think about what they were made of. "Look at this," I whispered, pointing my light at some old papers scattered near a collapsed tunnel. They had government logos on them, dated 1953, the same year the farmer mentioned. "Project Crawler," the title read. The rest was too faded to read clearly, but I saw words like specimen and containment. "They knew," Michael said, his voice tight with anger. "They knew about these things and they just covered it up." Suddenly, Beth let out a small gasp. Her eyes had gone wide, and she was staring into the darkness behind us. I can hear them," she said. "Not just the clicking. I can hear them talking to each other." Michael and I exchanged worried looks. The scratch on her leg was now completely white, and small veins of white were starting to spread up her calf. "They're looking for us," she continued, her voice sounding strange and distant. "They're so hungry. They've been sleeping for so long." A loud screech echoed through the tunnel, closer this time. Beth covered her ears and screamed, not in fear, but like she was in pain. "Too loud," she whimpered. "Everything's too loud." I shone my light down the tunnel and saw something that made my heart stop. There was a large chamber ahead, and in it hundreds of white cocoon-like shapes hung from the ceiling. Some were moving. "It's a nest," I whispered. "They're all waking up." Michael helped Beth to her feet, but she seemed different now. Her movements were jerky, and she kept tilting her head like she was listening to something we couldn't hear. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There has to be another exit." But as we turned to go back the way we came, Beth suddenly grabbed Michael's arm. Her grip was so tight he winced in pain. "No," she said, but her voice didn't sound like her anymore. It had a clicking quality to it. "The Queen wants to meet you." That's when we noticed her eyes. They were starting to fade, like they were being covered by a white film. Michael tried to pull away, but Beth was stronger now, much stronger, and behind her, in the darkness of the chamber, more clicking sounds were getting closer. We were running out of time, and I had to make a choice: my brother or our escape. But looking at Beth's changing face, I realized with horror that we might already be too late. I grabbed Michael's other arm and pulled him away from Beth with all my strength. "That's not Beth anymore," I said, my voice breaking. "We have to go." "No," Michael fought against me, reaching for his wife. "Beth, honey, please fight it." Beth's head snapped toward us, her movements becoming more jerky and unnatural. Her skin was getting paler by the second, and her fingers. They were getting longer, the nails hardening into claws. When she spoke, her voice was a horrible mix of clicks and words. "The Queen. She's been waiting for new blood," Beth said, taking a step toward us. "She needs hosts." Suddenly, the chamber behind her lit up with dozens of pale, eyeless faces. The creatures were emerging from their cocoons, dripping with that burning liquid. The clicking got louder, like a terrible chorus. "Michael, we have to run, now." I pulled my brother hard, finally getting him to move. The sound of Beth's inhuman scream behind us tore through my heart, but I kept running, dragging Michael with me. We sprinted through the tunnels, our headlamps bouncing light off the wet walls. I could hear them following, not just Beth, but dozens of them. Their clicks echoed from every direction, like they were hurting us. There! I spotted an old ventilation shaft, a metal ladder leading up into darkness. But as we reached it, Michael stopped. "I can't leave her," he said, tears streaming down his face. "She's my wife. Look at me." I grabbed his shoulders. "That thing back there isn't Beth anymore. They'll turn us into them if we don't get out now." A screech from nearby made us both jump. In the beam of my headlamp, I saw Beth crawling along the wall like a spider, her body twisting in ways that shouldn't be possible. Behind her, the other creatures were closing in. "Please." Beth's voice was almost gone now, replaced by clicks and hisses. "Join us. It doesn't hurt anymore." I shoved Michael toward the ladder. "Climb. I'll hold them off." I pulled out our last flare and lit it. The bright red light made the creatures shriek and cover their faces. Beth fell from the wall, writhing on the ground. "Richard, come on!" Michael called from above. I started climbing, but something grabbed my leg. Beth's new claws dug into my flesh, and I could feel that burning sensation starting to spread. "Brother," she clicked, "stay with us." I looked down at what used to be my sister-in-law, at her white, eyeless face, and made the hardest decision of my life. I kicked hard, breaking free, and scrambled up the ladder. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not sure if I was talking to Beth or Michael. We reached the top of the shaft, emerging into the early morning light. As we pulled ourselves out, we could hear the creatures screaming below, unable to follow us into the sunlight. But my leg, where Beth had scratched me, I could feel it starting to change. I looked at Michael, both of us knowing what this meant. "You need to go," I said, showing him the spreading white patch on my leg. "Get help. Tell people what's down there." "Richard, no." "I can feel them in my head," I said, fighting to stay focused. "The Queen. She's calling. You have to go. Now." Michael backed away, sobbing. I watched him run until he disappeared into the trees. Then I turned back to the shaft entrance, the clicking in my head getting louder. They were waiting for me below. My new family was waiting. And soon, when the Queen was ready, we would all come up together to find more brothers and sisters to join us in the darkness. This is Michael's story now. I found a ranger stationed 5 miles from the cave and called for help. But when the authorities arrived, they weren't regular police or rescue teams. They came in black vehicles with government logos, the same ones I'd seen on those old papers in the mine. They quarantined the whole area. Men in hazmat suits went down into the caves with special equipment. I tried to tell them about Beth and Richard, but they acted like they already knew what was down there. "Sir, you need to come with us," a stern-looking woman in a dark suit said. She showed me a badge I didn't recognize. "This is a matter of national security." They took me to a facility where doctors checked me for any signs of infection. For 3 days, they asked me questions about everything we saw. They seemed especially interested in Beth's transformation and how fast it happened. "The conversion is getting faster," I heard one scientist mutter while looking at my file. "They're adapting." On the 4th day, they showed me videos from 1953. The same creatures, the same white skin and eyeless faces. But back then, it took days for infected people to change. Beth's transformation had taken hours. "Your brother and wife aren't dead," the woman in the suit finally told me. "They're part of the colony now. The Queen, she's building it." "Can't you stop them?" I asked. She shook her head. "We've tried. In 53, in 72, and again in 88. Every time we seal the caves, they find new ways out. They're getting smarter, stronger. Your wife, she's probably one of the Queen's new favorites now." That night, in my monitored room, I heard it, that familiar clicking sound coming through the ventilation system. And in my head, I heard Beth's voice, but different now, mixed with Richard's. "Soon, brother. We're coming for you. The Queen wants her family together." I screamed for the guards, but they were already rushing in. As they evacuated the facility, I saw pale shapes moving in the shadows of the corridors. The colony had found a way in through old mine shafts under the building. They moved me to a new location, somewhere in the desert. But it doesn't matter where they hide me. I can still hear them at night, clicking in my dreams. Beth and Richard are out there, changing more people, making their family bigger. And sometimes, when it's very quiet, I can hear the Queen too. She's patient. She's waited decades before. She can wait again. But the clicking is getting louder every night, and the white patch I found on my arm this morning, I haven't told the doctors yet. After all, family should stick together.